Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It looks like we still have some more stragglers coming in this morning. I guess people had a great time on the town last night. The focus of this session is on sustainable urban futures with an emphasis on institutions and governance. Throughout the day yesterday, what I kept noticing was that there were a tremendous amount of cases and a lot of people trying to unpack cases. I also noticed a lot of kind of defaulting to sustainability, climate change. These are really new. We don't really know a lot, so let's focus on the case. And then we sort of dropped off. And I would agree, especially when we start talking about adaptation in cities, that this is something that is a very new field for us, and obviously we've been hearing a tremendous amount about that in this conference. However, I also want to suggest that essentially we can do better. Looking at global environmental change in urban areas is not something new. So we will always be thinking about a new policy arena. We'll always be thinking about a fledgling topic. We'll always be faced with the challenge of looking at a dynamic process. That's the beauty of what we do. That's also the challenge of what we do. One of the things that we have in this panel, and I think we have collectively a strength that we can draw on, is in fact, often when we think about other areas, we rely on post hoc accounts. But much of what all of us are doing is we're driving into the trenches, and we're studying these processes as they unfold. So this gives us a tremendous amount of power, a tremendous capability of really building scholarship in a concerted and collective way. And so we can begin to think very carefully about governance processes. We can begin to think about why is it that we're seeing institutions perhaps change even though they're inclined toward inertia. We can begin to understand the details of institutional change, their resilience, or for that matter, the times when we really have barriers that we can't overcome. And we can begin to build some levels of coordinated and concerted theory in these areas. And so what we have on this particular plenary is three very different vantage points. We have a practitioner perspective with Raf Tufts from UN Habitat. Tuts, I'm sorry, I'm sleepy this morning, I see. We also have what I'll call a boundary spanner. Shuaib Lwasa from Makerere University is both a practitioner and a scholar and an academic. And Harriet Bulkeley is on the strict academic side, I would say, from Durham University. What each of them will do is draw on their particular cases of sustainable development and climate adaptation and mitigation. And at the same time, what I've encouraged them to do is to help us draw out the broader lessons. So not just leave us with the details of their case, but really to help us begin thinking about what it means to plan, what it means to take action, what it means to implement in a context that is dynamic and unfolding. I've also asked them to go by the rules. This is a session on institutions, so I tried to be democratic in the institutions here. I polled all of them yesterday. I talked to them very carefully about their presentations, how long they were, how many minutes they needed, and I offered to cede all the rest of my time from now and also at the end to them. So our rules right now are that we are actually going to end 10 minutes later than we anticipated. Since we're starting 15 minutes later, we'll end at 10:40. And have a 20-minute break. Each of them will talk at 15 minutes, and then if they run up past 20, I'm actually going to turn off the microphones. So this will ensure that we have an ample amount of time for discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Raf Tuts. He is the Chief of Urban and Environment and Planning Branch of the UN Habitat Program, and he's based in Nairobi, and he's going to talk to us about the Cities and Climate Change Initiative.
Thanks, JoAnn, for this introduction, and thanks to the organizers, UJEC, for inviting Habitat to this meeting. We feel this is quite important to make these bridges between research and global policy setting, which is our responsibility, and we're very happy to be here. UN Habitat is the United Nations agency dealing with cities, with urban development. Our main goal, long-term goal, is finding ways for sustainable urbanization, which is a broader concept cutting across large cities, small cities, and other settlements. We try to balance normative and operational work. We try to find a balance between guidelines, setting norms, and also practicing what we preach. And that's why I'm going to focus on some initial lessons of an initiative which we started in 2008. And as JoAnn said, this is by no means a final judgment. These are some early lessons, but I think some of them really can feed into the discussions which started yesterday. What I would like to do is briefly describe this initiative and draw some lessons, particularly concerning the topic of this session. Of course, it's a broader initiative, but particularly concerning issues of urban governance systems and also the role of urban planners, because I think we agree that urban planning is one of the key entry points into adaptation and mitigation action. And then I would like to end with some hints on where some innovation needs to go and make some suggestions for research with you. I'm lucky that yesterday our colleague George Martin has sketched very convincingly the future patterns and also the need to focus on rapidly growing secondary cities in developing countries where most of the growth will occur over the next 40 years, and particularly to cities of less than 500,000 inhabitants, and that's really where we are focusing on with this initiative. Indeed, there are going to be major implications in terms of poverty and also the link between poverty and environmental issues, and that's really where we are focused on. We started this in 2008, really inspired by the Bali Action Plan and then the whole local government movement. Cities can act. We stressed that yesterday, and we're part of this movement from a United Nations point of view, helping local government movements to have their voice heard. And then gradually we started up a field initiative, which was then endorsed by our governing council in 2009, and now we are active in 18 countries. We use a kind of a relatively conventional process model, which is really what we learned from the last 20 years working in urban environment, but of course adapted to the needs of climate change. So it's really starting with a political decision, a political willingness by the city government to engage in this. And then there are some assessment steps, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, with both national consultation and city consultation. We want to emphasize national-local dialogue as an important part of our work. And then action plan, which leads to implementation. Some of it we do, some of it is done by city's budget, some of it is done by international resources which we help the city secure. And then ultimate aim is obviously consolidation, institutionalization, which we try to start from the beginning. This process is not cast in stone. Sometimes we jump in the second or third step, depending on the capacity and and the awareness of the city. These are the cities where we are working now. We started with 4 and gradually then expanded to 5 additional cities in Africa and 9 additional in Asia. We're not very strong yet in Latin America and Arab states, and that's the focus of our fundraising for the next couple of years. You see, some of these cities are very small, like 30, 40, 50,000 inhabitants. Others go up to 1 million, but not much higher than that. So that's really the range we're talking of. Cities with relatively limited planning capacity in general, but with very rapidly growing urban populations. Apart from the city work, which I'm going to focus on, we kind of mirror that with some normative work, and which is the main piece of that is a global report on UN settlements, which will be focused entirely on climate change and cities, which will be launched in April 2011 at our governing council. And apart from that, we have a whole plan, and part of this is already implemented, of supporting tools. Some of it focused on mayors, advocacy work for mayors, some of it really focusing on urban planners, other on more technical tools on how to raise finance, and a lot of it also on focusing on work with university, trying to change curricula to reflect climate change concerns. So this is a master plan. Half of it is already in the works, and gradually, so we use these tools, we test them in cities, and then feedback from the cities helps to refine these tools and then spread them out in other countries and regions. I'd like to focus a little bit now on one city, in the interest of time, which is a small city, 150,000 people in the Philippines, 600 kilometers south of Manila, which is heavily battered by tropical typhoons, storm surges, sea level rise, with very vulnerable groups living close to high-risk areas or in high-risk areas. So this is the typical scenario we are looking for in the selection of cities, where basically climate change is affecting vulnerable populations primarily. There are other cities where that is not the case. This cannot be generalized. In some cases, it's actually higher income populations that will the first victims. But in most of the cities we are working, this is the case. And it's starting from an adaptation perspective, but then also gradually building in some mitigation elements, such as urban transport and alternative building materials, which goes actually much easier than we initially thought. We find that generally cities are quite receptive to embrace a mitigation agenda as part of their climate plan. This is just an example of the type of assessments we are doing. It's really fundamentally looking at what are vulnerable places, vulnerable people, and vulnerable sectors, and based on an assessment of the hazards, obviously. And then this boils down to certain hotspots in the cities where sometimes different hazards are coming together, flooding, landslides, storm surges, and then this gives us a good frame for prioritization of action. As part of a longer-term sustainable development effort. Of course, assessing the adaptive capacity is also an essential element of our approach. Now, just some of the results. This is one of the early programs. We started that, I think, mid-2008, so it's really 2 years, and I think one of the successful ones where we can already see some institutionalization, which is quite, I think, remarkable in a 2 years time frame. We did assessments, climate actions are starting both in mitigation and adaptation. We managed to upscale one of the tools which was developed by the people in Sorsogon, and use that in other Asian cities. We are integrating these planning elements in comprehensive land use plan, which are statutory plans in the Philippines, and also mainstream it in city development strategies. And the interesting thing is that already this is seeing replication in the region, and mainly thanks to working with local universities who were involved from the beginning, and then also were able to bring in more cities on board. But very importantly, also at the national level, we were able to already make some impact. Of course, cannot be fully attributed to this program, but I think we started at the right time, and were able to influence the Climate Change Act of the Philippines, which now has a very clear emphasis on the role of local government. I think that's really what we would see as probably the major achievement in the long run of this initiative so far. And so it's really this dialogue between local and national which is critical, and which we feel should be an element of any local climate action. Now, there are some challenges, of course. One of the main challenges we have seen there is the sometimes difficult relationship between the city and the province. The province, which is not so much bigger than the city and its suburban areas, and sometimes you find that climate change is being used as a political agenda in terms of partisan politics between the mayor and the governor and for their next elections. And that's what we have seen as one of the more difficult things to handle, which shows, first of all, the appeal of climate change as an development issue, and also an issue, especially in the Philippines, where the vulnerability and the threats are so clear. But also it shows one of the weaknesses and the need for full integration and institutionalization. Now, I'm not going to give any other detailed cases because of time constraints, but Mozambique, Maputo is a similar, bigger city with very serious stresses, but not only climate, also food, energy, different crises coming together, and the local government struggling with riots, and where I think the crisis at the local level has reached a tipping point, and where it almost risks to move into a kind of almost a revolt of the most vulnerable people, getting high bread prices, floods, and high fuel prices at the same time. And not easy to work in such a situation, but one of the works we have been doing there is institutional strengthening of a local government unit, really focusing on climate change close to the mayor. Esmeraldas, just maybe one interesting point there. We're here talking about hill slides and vulnerable river banks, and we're really focusing on those populations. But there we had a very interesting problem, meaning that the downscaling of the IPCC climate projections at the local level created a lot of confusion. It didn't give clear results, whether it's going to be extremely or much wetter or much drier, and you got very, very strange kind of conflicting scenarios, which led initially to some stifling of action, and which really wasn't very helpful to start an action planning process. So I'm going to comment on that later. Again, this is something very critical, that there is always going to be uncertainty about climate data as well as population data in the future. And the last impression I would like to give is a city where we just started a couple of months ago, but which is taking off very, very nicely in Sri Lanka, a very small city, but which has done in a couple of months both greenhouse gas inventories in a very creative way, and risk assessment, and already trying to look at all the activities they are doing, and we're quite impressed also with the collaboration between the municipal council and the local university, which really is taking off very well. So these are some fertile grounds for adaptation work. Okay, coming to some of the lessons, and one of the big questions which is being asked is, do you go for a standalone climate action plan, or do you straight try to mainstream it in existing development plans? What we met actually with all these cities in June on the occasion of the ICLEI's Resilient Cities meeting, and we looked at this problem, or this issue particularly, and we found that there are advantages for both approaches. So while maybe we would be tempted to promote full mainstreaming from the beginning, we see that there are some advantages in starting with a standalone action plan, because there are some opportunities linked to it. It's flexible, you start when you want, you create some visibility, you can attract some funding, you're not dependent on other planning mechanisms for your monitoring, and so there are some advantages, but it should not remain at that level. You should be able to find a way into the formal, the statutory planning cycles, and it should eventually be anchored in institutional and sectoral responsibilities. So really this is, I think the jury is still out on this issue, but we feel we need a more kind of a combined approach, maybe where something separate, a framework can be started and can then feed into more mainstreaming work later. But it's always going to be a mix and always going to be tailor-made for the cities. Some other lessons of the program are the following. I mean, we feel that, you know, you can enter from different corners, from water, from the slums as an entry point. You can look at from the climate proofing of infrastructure, drainage, from community resilience, from early warning. There are different entry points, and we always find an appealing one and build from there. I've talked about this data uncertainty which you need to overcome to get started, and I would like to emphasize the city as a locale, as a room for experimentation, as opposed to the national level. National level should provide a clear framework, but I think we need to leave some flexibility, some experimentation at the city level. This is a long haul effort. It's going to be a long haul effort, and I don't think we know at this time what the real let's say the high impact actions are going to be. So I think we need experimentation. We also see that climate action offers opportunity for improved governance. You know, the need to tap into community knowledge, which is extremely important to make climate action plans, forces the council to engage in a more harmonious way with populations. The need to have, let's say, mitigations following certain standards really is an incentive to for accountability, for strictness, and also the fact that you will choose and you have to make choices, choose certain neighborhoods, also forces the city to be equitable, to look at where the most vulnerable and the poorest areas are, and make resolute choices, because you can't do everything at the same time. Now I want to, before finalizing, to point out to two innovations which are emerging and which I think can provide a way forward for a more integrated and upscaled approach to climate action. First is what we are calling, we are doing these two together with the World Bank and with UNEP, and as a joint work program. One is really, you know, always the problem in small cities is one sector is not big enough to allow for climate, for carbon financing. So we feel that you need to find a system to bring different sectors together, such as transport, waste, water, energy, and urban forestry, and then combining them, build a package, a citywide package of climate mitigation action. We have now formally submitted that as a methodology to the CDM board, and we hope this will be accepted, and if it is, it will open, let's say, the CDM for a much larger group of small cities, that whereby different sectors together can be big enough for climate credits as opposed to one small sector. I don't think we have more time, but this is something I think promising.